I can exclusively reveal secret polling which shows voters are starting to blame Anthony Albanese personally for the state of the economy. The internal research carried out for the Liberal Party suggests Australians are now holding the Prime Minister accountable for soaring petrol prices, increasing energy bills, the high cost of groceries and crippling mortgage repayments. This is dangerous for Albanese. He'd been hoping inflation would start to moderate, a hope cruelled by the RBA's reality check that there's no prospect of a rate cut anytime soon. Albanese is already seen as a hypocrite for blaming former PM Scott Morrison for the first interest rate rise, while now not accepting responsibility for the 13 since. But he's largely escaped blame for the cost of living crisis. This new research I'm reporting tonight shows that voter sentiment is hardening against Albanese over his handling of the economic crisis. Given he campaigned at the 2022 election, more than 2 years ago now, on a promise of making life more affordable, he can no longer escape responsibility for the tough times many of you are experiencing. This comes as his government and many of the states seem intent on spending money to win over voters, spending that is now being blamed for keeping inflation and interest rates higher for longer. It puts Albanese and the states on a collision course with the RBA after injecting an extra $22 billion into the economy this financial year. It's one of the reasons inflation is now not expected to return to the target band until 2026, and why the RBA even considered hiking rates this week. Governor Michelle Bullock stung the Albanese government when, in part, she blamed high spending for the need to keep rates higher for longer.
Make no mistake, inflation is still too high, and the board does remain concerned about the degree of excess demand in the economy. In the Statement on Monetary Policy, we've revised up our forecast for demand growth, and that's due to stronger forecast public spending.
She also spoke about the impact of low productivity. Other senior RBA economists fronted a Senate estimates inquiry today to reinforce the message that government spending is partly responsible for this cost of living crisis.
Public spending is one part of demand that we track. We're looking at the latest announcements coming out from the various state budgets, from the federal budget, and what we actually see coming through the data as well, how projects are progressing on some of the big infrastructure activity that's happening. Here in Sydney, for instance, a lot of the work around the bridge and the tunnelling and things, this is big enough that we can see it coming through in the aggregate data.
And the RBA's statement on monetary policy specifically says that public demand is forecast to be stronger than previously expected, reflecting recent public spending announcements by federal and state and territory governments. Well, Treasurer Jim Chalmers rejects the notion spending is fuelling inflation.
Budget spending is not the primary determinant of prices in the economy, but we can be helpful, and we are being helpful with the design of our cost of living policies, which help us get back to targets sooner.
Despite his remarks, economists today seized on the RBA's comments to urge governments to stop spending so that rates can begin to fall. AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver told a Senate committee today that government spending was having a significant impact on inflation.
When asked, well, why have the forecast gone up, she specifically referred to, we got some numbers on higher government spending. There's other things in there as well, but I have a feeling that if we had, say, much lower growth in government spending, the Reserve Bank would either be considering cutting or much closer to cutting.
Chris Richardson is one of the only economists who's consistently argued government spending was inflationary. He told me today that extra state government spending this year amounts to around $12 billion. So that from state governments, while federal government decisions have added around $10 billion extra into the economy. Add in the Stage 3 tax cuts, and Chris Richardson says this is an extra $46 billion being poured into the economy this financial year. And he told me that this is equivalent to the best part of just under 2% of national income. He says that's huge relative to the amount of money the RBA's rate rises have taken out of the economy. He says the Reserve Bank is taking money out of the economy and the governments are putting money back into the economy. And Chris Richardson also argues the energy subsidies of $75 a quarter were simply delaying the pain and that inflation would rise once the subsidies end. Now, while they reduce the energy component of CPI, they are also still inflationary. And Chris Richardson said, and I quote, "The basic point is that families have more ability to spend than they otherwise would have had." It's a point economist Warren Hogan made on this program the other night.
If electricity is 100 and it goes to 110, but the government gives you a subsidy and says it's only going to cost you 105, the electricity generator is still getting 110, but the CPI says it's only going up to 105. But in the following year, they remove the subsidy, the consumer pays 110, and even though the electricity price hasn't changed, the CPI will measure it as an increase. So it's just a mask in terms of inflation. So if you remove the subsidy, inflation will go up.
Now, for the RBA to even publicly mention government spending, it's an indicator of the level of frustration at the central bank. Economics journalist Tom Jucevic writes that the scene is now set for an almighty tussle between the bank's board and politicians facing voters over the coming year. He says there will be harsh words, finger-pointing, and no political prisoners. Now, if this new message from the central bank hits home to voters, that government spending is responsible for high interest rates, then Albanese will become a national villain. That new research I revealed at the start of the program, showing voters are turning on Albanese personally for his management of the economy, well, this will put pressure on him to act if he wants any chance of winning the next election. The path from now to that election is full of risk for Albanese. His political prospects are inextricably linked with our economy.